In this presentation, I'm going to talk about import substitution industrialization, largely as it applied to Latin America, where it really, that was where it was used the most. And in a lot of ways, ISI is, you think ISI and you think Latin America. The presentation is going to go on and consider the alternative to import substitution, that is export-led industrialization, ELI, which, spoiler alert, is basically what we call globalization today. No one calls it ELI. It's basically, what a lot of people, or there are a lot of definitions of globalization, but it's synonymous with at least one of them. So I'll talk about, why the export-led approach ended up being preferred. What is import substitution industrialization? Basically a policy of encouraging growth of import competing industries. That is domestic production of things that you otherwise imported. And the idea was that countries would try to, they felt that they were at a disadvantage. They were in a dependent relationship because they were producing commodities, the crops, the various crops that were being produced in the agricultural sector, mines, copper was a big, output, and these things were seen as being, they weren't manufactured. And there was this idea that you were selling commodities, inputs for industrialization to the North or the West, depending on how you want to define it, but to the more developed nations, and buying manufactured products. And the idea was that that kept you dependent. So clearly what you need to do is manufacture your own stuff and compete with the imports, right? So you would develop your own industries to compete with these imports. And the idea was this would improve your internal terms of trade, meaning the value of what you were producing versus what you were buying. And you want, basically the way that worked was you were going to encourage the growth of domestic industries by protecting them from foreign competition. An idea that, this is very often called the infant industry approach. And this is an idea that was, promulgated by no less than Alexander Hamilton. This is kind of part of the mercantilist approach to things. And Hamilton was very much a proponent. This is very similar to the kinds of things that Hamilton wanted. So in a way, the ideas are not outlandish at the get-go. It seems like a very reasonable approach, and that's why it made a lot of sense to a lot of people. So how do you go about doing this? Basically, the big thing that ISI requires is tariffs, import quotas, and subsidies. And the first two restrict foreign trade, right? Your tariffs, a tariff is a tax on incoming things. And so, you say, all right, if you want to import cars into our country, well, you're going to have to pay a 25–50% tariff or whatever. And that will jack the price of the foreign built car. An import quota is a maximum, right? We will only import 10,000 cars or a dollar value of cars, right? In some way. And after that, you shut off the pipeline. And then the price of these cars, what import quotas tend to do by restricting the amount that you import, they jack the price of each car or each imported item without collecting a fee. And the problem is, with a tariff, if you put a 50% tariff on, 50% the most it'll go up. Import quota, who knows? You're going to end up with, you're basically jacking the price on it for the manufacturer. And subsidies on the other idea is that you subsidize an industry. One, and these are basically two different approaches, right? We can protect from foreign competition, or we can subsidize, right? We can give money to a company, say, well, you need to get started, so we're going to give you money and get you going, and give you a leg up. And in that are two different aspects, two different approaches to basically the same thing. So that's the core thing. Other things that went in, you tended to overvalue your local currency, right? You wanted to pursue a strong currency to lower the price of your imports, because if you're going to make cars, you're going to need to buy stuff, and a lot of the stuff you're going to have to import, right? And so you want your currency to be strong. Exact opposite of what we think people do when you hear charges of currency manipulation. It's usually to get the price down so that a country's exports are cheap, right? That's what China is accused and has done in the past. And a lot of nations are accused of doing that. This is the opposite of that. You're trying to make your currency more expensive, more valuable, because you need to buy these inputs. The policies often, it's not necessary, but very often state creation and ownership of firms was needed, because a lot of countries, they needed, this was the easy way of going about it, right? How do we get, if we want an auto plant, how do we do it? Well, we own it, right? How about we just through the government directly create a firm and run it in the public interest? Especially in countries where maybe they don't have a good capital market, where entrepreneurs can go out and get funds. They don't have a stock market. I mean, if you don't have the institutions, the history of starting up companies and running them, very often it's just easier for the state to say, the hell with it, we'll do it. Another way to go about this too is, again, to make up the deficit of local experience, is to attract multinational corporations for local production and say, all right, we want to have a car plant, but let's get GM in here and have them create a plant, or Volkswagen or Ford, and all of these companies did that, and they come in and they produce for local production, and they are quite happy to do so because they have all these protections from their competitors. So, another thing is that very often in whether the state runs the firm or it negotiates a multinational to come in, you try to negotiate high wage rates, and you want, the country is going to try to have money in its workers' hands, because they need to be able to buy the cars or the clock radios, or whatever you're making, right? They need to be able to buy it. And so you have to stimulate local demand, because all this stuff, you're going to be building these cars. You're not, like today, it's alien to us today. You're not building cars to export. You're building cars for the local economy, right? And so you need to have money in the local economy. And the key thing is, you're going to be, this is supposedly going to work because you're going to shift capital and labor from your agricultural, or I guess we could also say, if you have a mining industry, but it's your commodities sector, right? Mainly it's agricultural, to the industrial sector, right? And so you're going to shift money in, and a lot of times this involves taxing your crops that you export, and you want to move money out, and you set up incentives to, don't invest in your crops, invest in the GM plant, or invest in, this clock radio firm, or whatever, invest in the industrial sector. And that's a big movement of capital and labor. You're trying to get people off the farm and into the factories, right? And so these are the policies. And as I've been going through, you're probably going to see some problems. The overvaluation the local currency is going to have, because that's going to make people want to buy foreign imports, because their money's worth a lot of money overseas. We're going to see high wage rates and spending. Well, that can lead to inflation, and shifting labor. You're messing with the market and you're moving capital and labor from one sector to another. Is that really a good idea? Right? Is the question that you have to ask. So you can sort of see some of the seeds of the problems that are going to be identified here. So actual problems, right? ISI, and we just immediately go into the mismanagement. And one of the complaints about ISI is that even from people who promote it theoretically, is that it was just tended to be mismanaged, that where it had been put in, it had never really been done well. And this is kind of similar to a lot of people who, the Marxists, neo-Marxists will say, well, Marxism was never given a fair try because it was always put in some corrupt form. Not to link ISI to Marxism, but it seems like a similar comment. And so you get that, right? That ISI maybe it could have worked, but it was tended to be mismanaged. Why? First, the use of quotas and tariffs instead of subsidies. When you protect people from foreign trade, the government doesn't bear the cost, right? And in fact, when it imposes tariffs, the government gets revenue from the tariffs, right? So there is no local constituency to get rid of this protection. When you subsidize something, on the other hand, well, as long as you're pouring money into the factory, you could be using that money someplace else. And so there's always a constituency for that and the end of the subsidy. Also, the subsidies, if you say you're going to invest $1 million, because back when this was done, $1 million was a lot of money. If you're going to invest $1 million in a plant, there's your investment. When you put a tariff on, you don't know what the cost is going to be because to the society. It could be $1 million, it could be a few million. The additional cost of cars could be several million, right? When you put a quota on, you have no idea the price could skyrocket, and so you just don't know what the price is going to be, and so economists, if you've got, economists prefer the use of subsidies. If you don't use subsidies, they prefer tariffs over quotas because tariffs have a limit. It only can add 50% to the price. If it's a 50% tariff, maybe it's a 10% tariff. It only adds 10% to the price. Whereas a quota, who knows how high the price is going to go. These countries also tended to end up having to put tariffs on industrial inputs, especially when they moved in the second here from consumer goods to heavier industries, right? So a lot of countries went at first, they're producing clock radios or they're producing cars, and then they say, let's produce the industrial inputs. Let's make steel. Let's develop a steel industry. Everyone seems to want a steel industry because why should we import these things? And that, of course, when you make the steel industry, you put tariffs on the import of steel, and therefore every factory that uses steel in your country now is paying more money and probably getting lower quality steel is usually what happens when you do that. It even happened under the Bush administration when he had steel tariffs. It's like, oh great, you're protecting the steel industry, but every industry that uses steel is now having trouble and is paying more and getting lower quality steel. Awesome. So that was part of, another problem. They also ended up borrowing a lot of money. And the borrowing here was particularly problematic because you're borrowing money to build factories to sell products in your country. And so you're building, I'm going to borrow dollars overseas, build a clock radio factory, sell the clock radio for pesos, but my loan has to be paid back in dollars. So where are the dollars going to come from? And this was the problem with the international borrowing. And it's a problem, the United States, when we borrow money from foreign nationals, we get dollars. They pay in dollars. We just don't have this problem. We have huge foreign debt, but it's all dollar denominated, and we make dollars, right? I mean, that's the thing. So it's in our own currency. The debt here was, in most other countries, they borrow dollars and then they have to convert it in their local currency. So they have to, in order to get the dollars to pay off the loan, they've got to make something, they got to change their currency into dollars, right? This just adds another layer. And with ISI, you're borrowing money, borrowing dollars to produce products to earn pesos or whatever the local currency is, right? And how do you get the dollars back, right? What do you've got to do? And so, you sell pesos for dollars, right? You trade them. Well, someone with dollars has to want the pesos, right? This is the thing. And this is where the last thing was really bad, the neglect or wearing down of the agricultural sector, right? That these countries were shifting their resources away from the agriculture or the extractive industry, if that's what they had as well. And this was their dollar generating industry, right? And so you were moving people out of it. You were not investing in new technology, and therefore your ability to earn foreign dollars, basically, to make foreign currency was diminishing. And a lot of what was hidden in that was it was the belief that industry was just a loser, right? And so you didn't want to invest anything in it because even if you got better at producing commodities, the price of commodities would drop, right? This was the problem. And this is why people were letting it wear down and not worrying. They didn't want to invest in it because there was the feeling if we all invest in better agriculture, the price of our crops are going to drop globally, right? And God knows that happens. I mean, bumper crops everywhere, the bottom's going to fall out of the market. So, there was a reason for this, right? But there was still this problem of, well, yes, but this is how you make your dollars, and you need to pay off these loans. So the whole thing had a lot of contradictions in it. But very often, it was also just mismanaged in terms of, having state firms that aren't well run. There were those aspects too. They're not here because these are more substantive problems, inconsistencies within it. But for all these reasons, ISI just really never fulfilled its promise. In contrast, there's export-led industrialization, and here what you do is instead of trying to produce stuff for domestic consumption, you produce stuff to sell overseas. And this is basically what the Asian countries did, right? And this is very much associated with Asia, Japan and the Asian tigers, Korea and Taiwan and Hong Kong and all these other places. So what you're doing here is you're going to encourage export competing industries, and generally you do a lot of trade liberalization. That is, you remove barriers to foreign trade and investment, right? And so this is the neoliberal dream, right? And I'll just call it a dream. I'll keep it clean, but it's their best idea, right, of what they want to do. And like I say, this is often, certainly when Jagdish Bhagwati wrote in defense of globalization, this is what he was thinking. This is what he defines as the essence of globalization. This is what he defended about globalization, not like the financial chicanery or a lot of things that people call globalization. This is what Bhagwati, in his famous defense of globalization, defended. Now, why is Eli better than ISI? One idea of why it's better is that export-oriented growth is just technologically superior, right? You're going to produce stuff for sale overseas to a global market. And so you're able to take advantage of optimum plant size and economies of scale. If you're making cars for one country, there are only so many cars that country is going to absorb. And as industrial technology has grown, the plants have gotten bigger and bigger. And in fact, looking decades down the road, we now see you build a plant and, it's very often, a lot of the plants built in the American South, they specialize in producing one type of car and they sell it globally, right? They have no intention of selling it in the country where it's produced, but they focus on it. And there's kind of this idea that there's this optimum plant, right? And it tends to be big, right? But there's this optimum size, don't want it to be too big, but and that optimum size changes as technology changes. But the point is that you don't get it, right? When you're just producing for one country. You're not participating in the economies of scale that might exist in the industry, right? So that's a problem. Also, with ELI, right, your growth of your successful industries, right, because you're going to have winners and you're going to have losers. The growth of the industry is not limited by the growth of the local economy, right? You're tapping into the global economy. And so even if your country has a problem, right, a local recession, well, the world isn't necessarily in recession. Now you are buying into the ups and downs of the global market, but for a lot of developing nations, that's okay. I mean, that's better. They can grow their market, right? Whereas the thing is, if you're just making stuff for domestic production, anything, that hurts your economy takes down your successful industry with it. And so it's basically this idea of you're spreading your risk around with ELI, all your eggs in one basket with ISI. That might be an oversimplification, but more or less works. Also, your industries are open to foreign capital and competition, right? And the idea is that, this is a very neoliberal idea, very neoclassical economist idea, is that competition is important, and that if you want to compete with the world, you got to compete with the world. You can't say, all right, we're going to build an industry behind these tariff walls and it's going to become eventually magically efficient enough to compete. That's the idea of the infant industry, right? That when the industry matures, it is able to compete. And the argument amongst kind of the hardliners of markets is that, well, if you protect the industry, it's training wheels on the bike, right? When do the training wheels come off? And kind of the idea is they never do, that the industry will keep demanding protection, and it will grow up, and the protection will allow it to make a profit while being inefficient. And you're able to produce crap basically in the local companies and sell it behind these tariff barriers, where you can make stuff that you would never think of making in a global market. And in fact, the plants that moved down, there were a lot of MNCs that went down south, and they produced old, obsolete products because they were protected from competition. So here's the thing, also you have foreign capital. You can now borrow capital because you're borrowing dollars to make cars that you're going to sell for dollars. It makes sense. It just always, to me, just made more sense. And so you're able to attract foreign investors, right, to come in and let them play and let them take some of the risk and bring in the capital. And they're willing to do it because it's the big leagues, right? It's the global market, and they can make money, right, off of it, because if you can make money anywhere, it's the global market, right? I mean, if you can make money anywhere, well, global means anywhere. So this is the idea that it is a lot easier to do that. And finally, there's the idea it's just easier to make foreign exchange to earn it than to save it, right? Because the idea was that they would save foreign exchange by not buying imports. There'd be whatever dollars were coming into these countries through their agricultural sector well, we're going to save that because we're not going to be buying cars with it, and that's how we're going to pay off these loans. And it turns out, no, you can only save a portion of what you're making, and if what you're making is dwindling, it's going to be harder to save. Just go out and earn the stuff, right? And the money will flow to you, right? And you see, I mean, the most extreme example today is China, where they are just swimming in dollars, because they're earning the foreign exchange. Now, another problem with ISI is just that it was poorly managed, right? And this is like I've already mentioned this one, but they, they just the quantitative import restrictions, instead of being aimed towards, nurturing the industry and moving it along, they just ended up being out and out protectionism, and there became a constituency for keeping those walls because they weren't using subsidies, they were using the tariffs and the quotas, and so it just basically became protectionism. Licensing, very often the government in ISI, there can only be one car manufacturer, right? The problem with ISI when you're producing in your country is it's very often very limited, size of the market, and so you tend to have one manufacturer. And sometimes the state would own the factory, own that company. Other times it would give a license for it, and the state involvement in licensing becomes a big problem, because making money is not about being good at making cars or clock radios or bicycles or whatever it is you're making. It's about getting licenses, right? And who And Asimoglu and Robinson love, one of the things they talk about in Why Nations Fail, they contrast Carlos Slim, who's one of the richest men in the world, because he's able to buy these companies and win. It's not, when state-run companies were auctioned off, he bought them up, right? And he was able to, even though he didn't necessarily have the best bids, and so he's good at getting licenses and monopolies from company. And this is going on today, even after supposedly ISI is gone. And so the ability to get licenses, which is a political function, supersedes being an efficient entrepreneur. And they tended to, distort the markets, right? That there were a lot of quantitative controls put on products that just distorted the markets and screwed prices up, and that kind of thing leads you into big problems, right? In the end, and a lot of shortages and strange pricing and black markets and that sort of thing. So just, basically dogs and cats living together from an economist's point of view. Finally, this is a big thing about it, the political economy of ELI versus ISI, is that, if you're going to pursue export-oriented growth, this is very much the kind of golden fetters argument, right? That journalists, people, most economists will truck in it, will dip their toe in it. Journalists like Thomas Friedman likes to talk about the golden fetters, right? That you're going to, if you're going to compete globally, well, you're going to be disciplined, and you're not going to be able to do weird or stupid things, stupid from an economics point of view, and simply because your governments can't intervene in the world market. Right? They're price takers. They have to take whatever the price is, whatever the demand is around the world. They can't create more demand for the product like they could locally by pouring money into people's hands or restricting competition, and so they're at the mercy, and so they can't intervene. And also they're forced to be open, and they say just that it's a practical impossibility, right, to protect one's export industries, right, when you depend on foreign sources of capital and resources. That basically, once you buy into, if you're going to try to hawk your goods on the global market, you're going to have to open up your market, right? And that, if you, especially if you want to attract foreign capital, right, you're going to have, there are a lot of rules you're going to have barriers to bringing things into the country and taking things out that just have to go, right? Therefore, they kind of say, look, and if, export growth requires liberal trade regime, right, trade liberalization, and an efficient bureaucracy. You're going to have, these companies that come in, they're going to demand that the power be, that the power work, that the infrastructure be built, that their workers aren't being attacked on the way home, or that, that their property is safe. And, they're going to demand, if there's large corruption in the customs houses, which is more of a problem in these places, they're not going to put up with that, right? Because they're going to say, look, we can go someplace else. And these foreign, the foreign involvement and the ability to move things around, a lot of things that people complain about globalization, this is the kind of thing that just makes the shenanigans that went on under import substitution difficult, if not impossible, to maintain. And so this is the idea that ELI is does not allow the inefficiencies. It supports good growth of institutions, and or I should say growth of good institutions, and that it creates an environment where inefficiency in government is punished, is seen as a downside. And I mean, not everything's perfect. I mean, there's still going to be a lot of corruption and that kind of thing going on, but that the trend will be towards improving it, whereas ISI creates massive opportunities in the exact opposite direction. Right? And so that is where a lot of this came in.